Hey there everyone, it's Joe from Ainslie's Gold Silver Standard Insights, brought to you by goldsilverstandard.com and ainslieBullion.com.au. Today's topic is the petrodollar, Bretton Woods and Nixon. That's part one of a three-part series. I'll post a link below to the Ainslie website for you to follow along. Of course, we have Chris Tipper here to break down the morning's news, and joining Chris today is the author of said news, Alex Hutchinson from Siltech Precious Metals, a regular contributor. It's great to have her back. So, Chris and Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. To properly understand where we are currently in the markets, it's important to take a look back into our history to see where we came from. Today, Alex is joining us after taking a closer look at the petrodollar system and its origins as a solution to the financial crisis that was happening at the time, to see the implications for where we are now and going forward. With the US dollar pushing back up to extreme highs, the potential for a new system to emerge is growing by the day, as it increasingly looks like the status quo is no longer fit for purpose and is potentially going to crash the global economy in a way that could take decades to rebuild from. So thanks for joining us to discuss all of this, and welcome back, Alex.
Oh, thank you for having me, Chris, and nice to see Joe again too.
Well, let's jump in, and that article was great today, and I know that's the first part that you're looking at, a few parts to this, giving us that sort of background and history. But can you give us that sort of big picture overview of what happened historically and how we sort of got to where we are today?
So obviously we've talked a lot recently about what's been going on with the US dollar and causing inflation across the world. And what I'm trying to look at the moment is how the petrodollar started and why it started. So we need to look back when the previous reserve currency was going on. So the previous reserve currency was implemented around 1944 at the peak of World War II, when the Allies were looking at ways to trade between each other. Now, how they implemented it was under a thing called Bretton Woods, which was named after an area in the US that the deal was signed. Mm-hmm. So with Bretton Woods, it was the gold standard, and the US dollar was pegged to gold, and all other currencies were pegged to the US dollar. There was flexibility within the fixes, but that was, done on a yearly basis or a quarterly basis, just when needed. So what this did, though, was by about 1958, the US dollar was attached to gold, and countries needed dollars to rebuild after World War II. So basically, the European countries were devaluing, so to speak, their dollars against the US dollar. The US was running huge deficits and was settling these deficits with gold out of Fort Knox. Mm-hmm. Now, by the 1960s, the US had entered a recession because their dollar had appreciated so much that their goods were so expensive. So in around the 1960s, the Federal Reserve at the time, with Treasury, were trying to raise interest rates, but there was a new inward focus because the US was in recession to not allow them to do it. So they were just making it very difficult for the Federal Reserve, who should be independent, to increase interest rates. And this all sort of culminated by about 1971, when Nixon was in power, where he did an inward-focused policy, which was televised, which was called the New Economic Policy. Now, he was trying to achieve three things. There was a new job standard unemployment rate of 4% they were trying to reach. They were trying to stem inflation and cost of living. And the third thing was they were protecting the US dollar because the gold outflows had been so big. There's always been speculation that there was nothing left in Fort Knox at the time, but no one still knows. So what he did at the time was he cut taxes. He then put holds on goods, and then he put an import tariff of about 10% of anything coming into the US. Now, what this then did was all the European countries started to sell the US dollar. So then there was a huge deflationary pressure back on the US dollar. And short of it collapsing, because Nixon wouldn't allow any more gold outflows to settle any of the any of the outflows of US dollar, he then ran off to Saudi Arabia and said, hey, I'm going to give you lots of arms. I'm going to protect you from now on, but I want all oil settlements in US dollars. And that in 1973, that started what's now known as the petrodollar, which became the new reserve currency because the gold reserve currency had collapsed.
So that's fantastic. That's a lot of information there. So I could see, as you were saying that, a lot of parallels with today. There seems to be some of those themes playing out. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
So the first one, and my favorite one, is comparing the new economic policy to America First by Trump.
Yeah, Make America Great Again.
Make America Great Again.
Well, that's
exactly what Nixon was trying to do. And really, it was the beginning of the end. Now, in the 1960s, when Kennedy and Johnson were in power, it was kind of the start of that. And Nixon was the final nail in the coffin. And if you look at what Biden's been doing, he is still very inwardly focused. He criticised the UK Prime Minister the other day for raising taxes, yet his spend on infrastructure and all these policies are highly inflationary, just like her tax cuts, but he's allowed to criticise them. And I found this fantastic quote from George Pompidou, who was the French Prime Minister back in the 1960s. Now, the French were probably the smartest European country at the time. They were making sure they got their gold on every exchange. So they were the ones draining the reserves. So they were highly critical of the gold currency at the time. And his line was, the international monetary system is functioning poorly because it gives advantages to countries with a reserve currency. These countries can afford inflation without paying for it. So it sounds a lot like the petrodollar now.
Absolutely. So we knew that back then, yet we still carried on anyway. And here we are all these years later in the exact same situation.
Same situation.
I find the whole thing quite crazy because I know that it has been building, and I know we're starting to see some trade happening outside of the US dollar. If you look at the BRICS, for example, we've got 20% of the world GDP and over 40% of global population sitting in those countries, or the BRICS plus now, because I know they're sort of looking to expand a little bit.
Yeah.
You compare that to the US having 16% of GDP and just over 4% of the population, you go, well, that there's a disparity there that's really being papered over by the strength of the US dollar and the fact that they have that as a reserve currency. Yeah. So there's a lot of things going on. I mean, you've got the BRICS countries talking about directly trading with each other in oil and commodities, which would be a threat to that petrodollar system. And you've even got, I know we were talking earlier about China potentially looking at alternatives to the SWIFT system and Russia wanting to get on board that. Obviously, they were booted out of that system.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of potential issues around the edges here. If you try to sort of step back a bit from the US. So when you're talking about them being very internally focused, if you start to move that focus out internationally, the rest of the world isn't necessarily going to accept an America First policy in this day and age, I wouldn't think.
Now, I think, this US reserve currency, I think what Nixon did back in 1973 was clever and a fluke. And if you look at who US was protecting back then, well, it was the Middle East. Well, I don't think they've got many friends left in the Middle East. They certainly don't have many friends left in Asia. And, I've just been to Europe, and I was talking to you about it earlier today, walking around Berlin at the moment, like my kids pointed it out, the graffiti in Berlin at the moment is fuck Biden. That is it. It is written absolutely everywhere. So he's run out, America's running out of friends. And we've spoken about the soy dollar from Argentina before. Mm-hmm. You've got the Chinese now trading with Russia on something called the CIPS. So
It was the China cross-border interbank payment system, I think.
That's it. So you've got China now trading with Russia with that, and you've got India, despite all the pressure around the world right now, saying to America and everyone else, no, we're going to keep taking the oil, and they're now saying they're just going to swap it straight for commodities. And then the nail in the coffin for the US right now is that Saudi Arabia is now talking about a petro yuan. So getting well away from the petrodollar. So there's a lot of movement away from all this money going back through the US, and therefore the reserve currency, is under threat.
Yep. And do you think, this is my personal opinion on it. You've had, when I have this conversation with people, often there's this sense of, no, that can't happen. The US is too strong. The US is too big and powerful. It's the global superpower. I feel that maybe there's a bit of complacency there and a bit of arrogance there. And the good example, I think, is recently when you talk about Saudi Arabia, them not necessarily coming to the party and butting heads a little bit with Biden. That's a real problem when you've got a relationship that's just assumed to continue when if you don't make the conditions good, if you don't look after your friends, then perhaps they go and look for new friends elsewhere.
Yeah, look, I think the Republicans have been very conscious of trying to keep this reserve currency going and trying to keep friends.
Yep.
And from what I'm seeing from Biden, he doesn't seem to be trying to keep friendly. So he was pressuring OPEC the other day to increase output, and their response over the top of what the US is doing to Russia was to drop production by $2 million barrels a day.
Yep.
They've done exactly the opposite of what they've asked. So, there comes a point when you forget who your friends are and you forget what got you there. And that just seems to be what's going on at the moment out of the US.
It's a problem. And I think we'll probably pull it up there, but there's a lot more to discuss, and that's why I'm really looking forward to your next couple of parts on this. So thank you for your work on that, and I'm looking forward to reading the other parts as they come through. So thanks for that, and we'll keep in touch and continue on this story.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me again.
All right. See you next time.
Okay. Bye.
Well, once again, thanks for being on the show, Alex and Chris. I'll see you on the next one. And of course, for the audience, head over to the Discord channel. That's discord.gg/gold, the perfect way to continue the conversation. Chris will be on there for the next 1 or 2 hours after the upload of this video. So ask your questions, you'll get a response, and give us your feedback. We really want to hear from you. Of course, I want you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Ainslie Bullion for the wide range of informational videos that you get 5 days a week, including specials as well. So check that out. And of course, while you're on the internet, head over to goldsilverstandard.com. That's bringing gold and silver into the digital world. As we say here at the end, balance your wealth in an unbalanced world. Take care, and we'll see you next time.